Hello, friends. Lee Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Melina Laboucan-Massimo. Melina is a Lubicon Cree, born in what's today called northern Alberta in Canada, in her people's village of Little Buffalo. One of the fascinating things about our tagline, exploring what it means to live a good life, is that phrase, good life, carries so many presumptions for so many people in so many different ways. It's not always clear what a good life entails. But for decades, I've been especially fascinated with individuals and communities whose social circumstances could not in any way be called good. And yet they found a way to live a remarkable life, what I would count as a good, sometimes even heroic life in the midst of those very difficult circumstances. Like the classic tale of David meets Goliath, or a community like a David meets a community or a power like a Goliath. And Melina is an example of just such a life, an exemplar of that kind of life. She's worked in social, environmental, and climate justice issues for the past 20 years, and she's done remarkable work. You'll hear in her story the ways in which her people and Indigenous people have suffered under first the forces of colonialism, and then more recently how that has taken the particular shape of resource extraction, $14 billion worth of oil and other valuable commodities taken out from underneath their feet without her people sharing in any of that wealth, or the particularly difficult reality of the way in which many Indigenous women and children continue to be targeted, and thousands of women and children dying under mysterious circumstances, including her own sister. A remarkable interview with Melina, and grateful for the spirit with which she does her good work in the world. Here's Melina Laboucan-Massimo. Melina Laboucan-Massimo is Lubicon Cree. She was born in her community of Little Buffalo, northern Alberta. Melina has worked on social, environmental, and climate justice issues for the past 20 years. She's the founder and executive director of Sacred Earth and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action. Melina holds a master's degree in Indigenous governance at the University of Victoria with a focus on energy transition. She's the lead author as well of the Just Transition Guide. Welcome, Melina.
Thank you for having me.
Grateful to have you with us today, and thanks so much for your time and all your good work in the world. Looking forward to discussing that with you today. I would kind of like to start in some ways at a kind of question that oftentimes comes at the end of an interview, but I want to start with this at the top of the interview today without yet digging into why these questions are so relevant. And that is to start with the question of how have you learned to cultivate perseverance in light of the many grave social, political, climate issues that you've worked with?
Well, I think I actually had to learn it the hard way, which was finding balance. As a young person in my 20s and 30s, I kind of worked very hard and very diligently on these issues, and in a kind of a nonstop, very fast-paced way. That resulting in close to 20 years of the impact on the body, and the body had to say, slow down. And so I think the tenacity of having, at that time, like an able-bodied way of being able to kind of move through the world and push the body to certain limits to try to achieve justice and be that change that we want to see in the world. I did include myself into the mixture. I didn't include myself into that equation. And I had to learn how to balance. And I feel like balance actually, in the longevity of it, can equate to perseverance. Because if you burn out, if you kind of, that flame dies, then there isn't perseverance. And so we have to find this balance within our body, minds, and spirits to move through the world in a way that does give the longevity and perseverance, because otherwise, for me, what I saw was, I'm pushing so hard that I'm actually hurting myself. And when I talk about for me, as an Indigenous person, the sacredness of Mother Earth and the sacredness of that relationship with Mother Earth, that we are in a sacred hoop, in that we're all part of the kind of, say, if you think of a wheels on a spokes, we're all a part of those spokes. But if we push too hard, one of the spokes can break, right? And so we have to be really diligent as well in how we move through the world. And so that, for me, I had to take a step back to be able to be in understanding that I had to do this for the long haul and not a short sprint. And so that's, for me, how we can continue to find perseverances through balance.
Was there, you said that you had to learn that the hard way. Was there any particular life moment or event that kind of forced you to accept this need for balance?
Yeah, I think growing up as an athlete, a dancer, a soccer player, baseball, track, I was very strong in my body. And I think I took that for granted. And when the forest fires started happening here up north, I think a lot of us don't understand the impacts of the particulate matter that is in the air. And for me, I kept working and traveling through kind of fire zones and wildfire kind of without PPE. You know, many people don't realize how detrimental that is to your lungs and your ability to breathe. And so I actually, from a small cold, ended up having bronchitis, and then it became reoccurring bronchitis. And so just health issues, and from kind of a culmination of that, becoming bedridden because the coughing became so bad that my ribs went out of place, you know, and so I wasn't taking enough time to stop. And becoming bedridden, being in so much pain you can't move or eat or like take on or off articles of clothing or brush your own hair. I think that's very sobering because you are no longer as independent. You know, I was a very independent young person, and to having that independence taken away by my own doing in a certain way. I mean, I'm not going to necessarily blame myself. These are societal and structural matters that of injustices that perpetuate and kind of ripple down into communities, including my own. So I'm not just going to take the own personal blame, but there's ways where you can personally, individually kind of say no to things and not keep saying yes. And having to make that kind of articulated understanding of you know, what our limitations are as human beings. And but humans are also very amazing, right? So we have like these amazing spirits that propel us to do all of these things, sometimes to our own detriment, but sometimes to our own amazement. So I think it's just really trying to understand, why am I doing this? Yeah. And so that was where I realized, okay, the bedridden, in bed for 4 months, you know, lost 25 pounds because I could barely eat, is very sobering. And you're like, you take a good look, hard look of, what am I doing here?
Yeah. How, continuing this question about wisdom you've learned, what particular wisdom practices have you especially held on to from traditional Indigenous practices of spirituality?
I feel like I had to relearn that balance because Indigenous knowledge is always about balance, about reciprocity with Mother Earth, never taking too much than you need and giving back. There's this balance of with the natural world, with other human beings. That's why we had treaties with other communities that pre-contact, you know, pre-colonialism. We had treaties of understanding to maintain that balance within the ecosystems even. And so from my understanding, was that achieving this type of balance came with like thousands of years of observation on our homelands, right? And so this Indigenous science made us understand there is this reciprocity. These ecosystems are very delicate, and they're not just pristine because it's an engagement. It's a stewardship of homelands that you have with Mother Earth. And so for us, it was about reciprocity. It's about the giving back and not taking more than you need. And so that is a very important Indigenous value that I've learned from a very young age. And also like how to, you know, like even my grandparents and my aunts and my uncles and my dad tell me about like just even as a young person, how we would, because I was on the horse and wagon as a young person, I saw the beauty and the bounty and of our homelands, like in the 80s, right? So this was many years ago, and it has changed drastically. And so you see when things are out of balance, the repercussions, right? And so for me, it was having to relearn that within my own body, but also seeing it all around me of kind of the impact when things are out of balance, when things aren't reciprocal.
Yeah.
Then there's that impact in the resulting climate crisis.
One more question about kind of wisdom or observations that you've developed over the decades of the work that you've done. In the theological tradition of which I'm a part, you often hear people speak of the so-called principalities and powers, right? So there are these systems and structures of power that at their best were created or intended for good for humankind, communities, the world. And yet they end up overreaching and prioritizing their own self-survival rather than the goods for which they were either created or intended. And that then can lead to all sorts of oppression and difficulties. So I guess the question I'm interested to hear you reflect on is, given the work that you've done, what would you say that you've learned about the way systems and structures of power work, either for good or for ill?
I think it's this understanding that a lot of traditions have, and you've probably for non-Indigenous peoples, I think there's this, and I'm curious actually where this comes from, but I've seen it in movies and this reflection of like, or in social media where this reflection is. It depends what wolf you feed. So do you feed the wolf of jealousy, of rage, of, you know, the type of kind of that, again, wanting and taking more than you need, and kind of this like hoarding, versus the other wolf of like love, compassion, sharing, care, concern for others, versus like the selfish kind of ego that, and so there's also Indigenous teachings around this as well that, you know, go back to, again, like times of origin stories. And so I was actually just visiting one of my colleagues that work with me at Sacred Earth, and she comes from the Cayuga Nation and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that's in Six Nations of the Grand River in Ontario. And we were sitting through ceremony to give acknowledgement and care for the seeds that are planted in their homelands that have been here for thousands of years. And they call them the Three Sisters. And, you know, the squash corn and see, this is not my teaching, this is their teaching, but all that to say is they have these twins, and it's the same premise of the wolves, of which one, you know, these dualities that we have even within ourselves, right? And so of which one do we feed? And so there's that thing, and there's always this question, you know, and even here in today's day and age, it's always like the good and evil of how do we which ones do we feed? And this isn't just within humanity, this is within systems, right?
Yeah.
And so when a system exists to exist, what is the purpose of that structure? Is that purpose of that structure to maintain power, dominance? Do those systems and structures result in injustices, systematic injustices? Or do those systems exist to hold humanity accountable, to ensure sharing, to ensure the reciprocity, right, that we see? And so our governance structures were made to have a regifting. So we have either Indigenous peoples in the West Coast have a potlatch system. We have a giveaway system. So within our ceremonial structures, the person who is the most wealthiest gives back. And that's that you can see inherently through our governance structures that is connected to our spiritual practices and ways of being. And so there's always this regifting back. So at the end of every ceremony, there is the person that has the most is usually the person that feeds the entire community or gifts back, materials or all these different things. So that's usually how it works. And so it's meant to be a redistribution of wealth. And so that's the way in which Indigenous understandings of how to have systems that are in place for the purpose and the benefit of good of all people. But I honestly do see the systems within all over the world, especially here in North America, where there's just such there would be an ability to have a distribution of sharing and redistribution of wealth, but we don't see that happening. We see a lot of hoarding. We see a lot of inequality. And that's really detrimental for all people because it creates a lot of issues, societal issues, as we know.
That's a really remarkable practice that you point to that I was not familiar with. It reminds me in the Hebrew Bible, one of the longstanding Jewish traditions was this teaching about Jubilee, where every 50 years there was this intentional redistribution of especially land as one of the primary forms of capital. And I think, as you were saying, our imagination often seems so paltry as to consider such practices as practicable. Things like that get dismissed as utopian or idealistic, and yet there you just described a scenario in which it's highly practical and has a profound impact upon the community. So yeah, that's quite lovely. So I'd love to turn now to thinking a bit about some of your own autobiography and story and the challenges that you've faced and continue to help work towards various forms of justice. And I would love first for you to kind of educate us a bit on some of the recent, by recent, I mean maybe the last couple of centuries of history with regard to Lubicon Cree and help people get a sense. I think a lot of times, obviously in academics and obviously in a lot of circles where people are doing lots of justice work, the notion of colonialism is often talked about, highly discussed, and there's very presumptions about what colonialism has entailed. And I think a lot of people maybe just don't, maybe on the street, they hear the word colonialism and not exactly sure what's meant by that. Or, in the U.S., we'll speak of the 13 colonies and not even kind of consider the sort of social or political implications of what it meant for there to be colonies. And so from your perspective, what are things that are key in the history of your people with regard to colonialism and how that has impacted your people's traditions and land and existence?
I mean, to be quite honest, it's impacted every way of being. And there's now a revitalization of Indigenous cultures, practices, traditions now because it was illegal. It was literally illegal to practice Indigenous governance, Indigenous spirituality, Indigenous family roles. It was basically everything was completely altered for about 100 years with colonization here in so-called Canada. So it has an immense impact. But I won't say it has completely altered the impact, but it has had such a detrimental impact. One example I'll give, and folks in the U.S. might be familiar with, but we here call them residential schools. In the U.S., I'm pretty sure they're called mission schools. And so what happened here, and I'll speak specifically to what happened here because I know the history a lot better than, even though we have very similarities. And after, traveling back and forth to the U.S. and having a lot of Indigenous friends and colleagues that I've worked with for decades, very similar stories. But here I'll speak specifically to what happened here is that the government created a legislation that still exists here in so-called Canada called the Indian Act. And it made the inability for Indigenous peoples to travel, to move about freely. They had to have cards, passes, similar to what you saw in the apartheid system in South Africa. There was an inability it was illegal to have a lawyer. It was illegal to gather in groups of more than 3. It was illegal to speak your Indigenous language and have ceremony in your own community, in your own home. So these things were all illegal. And so with the mission schools, what had happened was that it basically forcibly removed every single child from the age of 5, usually until the age of 18. There was obviously discrepancies and depending on what school existed where, but this was a government policy that was done hand in hand with the church for 100 years here in this country. And so as you can imagine, when a child is forcibly removed from their home at age 5, it is incredibly traumatic. And not only within those schools, there is now evidence through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was an inquiry that where there was testimonials from thousands of residential school survivors. Some children did not survive. So there's unmarked graves for children still. But what had happened was residential school survivors had testimonials. And so a lot of our family, though, say, for instance, my aunts, every single one of my aunts and uncles are residential school survivors. So it's very recent history. It's not like, 100 years ago. It's like literally my dad is a residential day school survivor, right? So I'm the first generation to not go to residential school. So all of my aunts and uncles were forcibly removed from my grandparents, who were amazing. We say Kokum and Muslim, so in our language in Cree, grandmother and grandfather, and they were amazing people, very respected, revered, known people that were within our community. Lots of people would come and pass through and visit, and so there was a lot of love and care from my grandparents, but it was illegal. So you would be imprisoned if you didn't release your children to the quote unquote Indian agents. So they were called Indian agents of the day, and they would come and take every single children from the family. And so as you can imagine how traumatic that is. And then even say, for instance, my aunts and uncles, my uncle, who was the youngest, my dad, because my dad wasn't born yet. And then he was actually hidden from Indian agents because my grandparents realized how horrible. They were being starved. They were being fed rotten food. In some schools, there was medical experiments being on the children. Many of them, if not all of them, were beaten. Many experienced sexual assault from the priests and nuns. And so it was a really horrible experience, as you can imagine, for these children. And the result of that has had such a massive impact on our families and communities. So my dad was actually hidden in what we call the bush, so on the trap line. And so my Muslim, so when my dad's the youngest. So when my aunt, who I'm still really close to, when she was 14, she told my grandfather and my grandmother, because they were able to return to summer and to be with our families, but many schools kept the children from age 5 to age 18, so they had no contact with their parents. So as you can imagine, that's a trauma. But even within the residential schools, they weren't allowed to even speak to their siblings, especially if it was boys and girls. So the boys and girls were separate sides of schools, slept separately. Obviously, boys and girls area, but they weren't even allowed to talk, like on the playground. If they were playing, they weren't allowed to engage. And so, as you can imagine, how traumatic is that? I was just thinking about it the other day of that's so traumatic. I think of our little boy now who's 21 months, and if he was taken, he wouldn't be able to talk to any family members. And so then you're so traumatized by these places of abuse, and then you have no one to kind of find any emotional support in, right? So as you can imagine, this is a colonial policy. So this is how colonization impacted families and communities. So it's just one example, right?
Yeah. So it's just like a systematic, carefully planned, intentional evisceration of culture.
Culture, language. When my dad finally went, so I'll give you another example. When my dad finally went back, so they hid him for 10 years. So my dad's Cree, his first language is Cree, which is amazing, right? Because a lot of Indigenous languages are being becoming extinct as a result of residential schools. So my dad, Cree is one of the few languages that is set to survive within so-called Canada, the 3 out of like hundreds, right? So he was hidden in the bush in the trap line every time the Indian agent came. This was illegal. Like my grandparents would have been jailed, even though they're like amazing, good standing people within our community, very well respected, still would have been jailed for not letting their child go. So he was hidden until finally residential day school opened up. So residential day schools, still every child had to go, but they could sleep in their own homes with their own parents, thank goodness, right? But they were still, even within there, my dad was beaten for not speaking English. So his like lunch times consisted of whippings because he couldn't speak English. So he had to, and then he was made to sit with, he said, like, you know, and as like a 9-10-year-old, like you have to sit with the 5-year-olds because you are so primitive and you don't know this language, English. And even though he's like very articulate in Cree in our language and learned, you know, old thousands of year old stories, like traditional knowledge from before the last ice age, like is a very, very, very wise person now. He has his, you know, master's in education and linguistics and a very wise person and the chief of our community. But like he had to go through just really horrible experiences because of, not speaking English, say, for instance.
You said this is still recent history, and obviously it is with your father, aunts, and uncles. But how recently had these practices began to come to an end?
Well, the last residential school technically closed in 1996 in Canada. But yes, so say, for instance, that they weren't open everywhere across the country at that point. So myself, I went to, you know, not a residential school, thank goodness, but I was in school in the 80s. So they kind of petered out, but they existed for 100 years across the country.
And did I read that Indigenous practices of spirituality were illegal until 1960?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, it's incredible. And then voting. What about voting rights?
As well as voting.
Huh. Yeah. What year were voting rights?
Same, 1960, 1961. So say women here in this country white women were able to vote in 1918. That's when the vote was brought for women, but yet Indigenous peoples were seen as obviously second-class citizens or subhuman and didn't have the right to vote in their own homelands where they had lived for millennia.
So when you think back about your own childhood and that reality of an imposition of second-class status or subhuman status, what was that like for you internally as a young girl or young woman?
I think for me, it was definitely something that I experienced because I live in like Alberta, which is little Texas of North, I'd say, of Canada. So definitely still racism, more overt racism that I say would exist here than in other parts of the country where I've lived. And so definitely throughout my childhood, being called like a drunken Indian, a dirty Indian, even though I'm like 10. And also like an athlete and like playing baseball and soccer and in dance, jazz, tap, ballet, you know, like, but still have these derogatory slurs thrown at me as a child. So it was definitely there. But I think because of being born and raised, born in my community and then raised in a neighboring town, going to school, and then eventually we came to here, Musqueam, which is Edmonton, and went to school here. And then also being raised by two parents. Well, my mom is the one that predominantly raised me, but having very close connection to my dad and my whole Cree side where I was born. I loved my family. I had such good memories of being out playing with my cousins and running after dragonflies and going on the horse and wagon and seeing the beauty of our homelands and being treated by my grandparents like as if I was just this like precious human being and also by all my aunts and uncles who still love me so much. And just that love of community and love and connection of my family. Like when people would say something like that to me, I thought it was the most ridiculous thing, right? Even as a young person, I was just like, obviously there was some shame, and, with racism, it kind of instills that shame sometimes, but I didn't internalize it. I just was like, my family's amazing. I love my people. Like, you don't understand. Like, I knew that even from a young age. And so I think that's where deep down, I was like, I'm going to do something about this. I think that started from a young age because of experiencing that.
And so do you think that experience, that profound experience of love in your family was one of the primary things that allowed you not to internalize that shame?
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. I was just, because my sister and my mom moved us out to the neighboring town. She taught in this community school, but then she eventually went back to university. And so we had to went in and out of the community a lot. So whenever we got to go in, the way that my family would kind of embrace us back with open arms, and especially my grandparents, because they didn't want us to be taken, even though they really loved my mom. And she's from a different background, but she's actually American. She's Italian American. So she was very much lived within the community for a decade, married my dad, still talks to my family. They still love her. So there was a lot of love, even though me and my sister were mixed, which was very uncommon at the time. There was just so much love that I felt from both sides of my family, especially my Cree side, that, because I was born there and then was there throughout my whole life. So it's there's a lot of love.
Yeah. So alongside colonialism, we've pointed to some of your experiences with regard to most recently in the conversation, the kind of just the outright racism, and then the sort of cultural imperialism of squashing of culture, squashing of language, suppression of all of those various markers of identity and family and tradition. But then another huge piece in the colonialist projects is resource extraction, and so often one of the driving economic intentions behind colonialism is to go in, pull out resources, and yet the people that live there don't profit from the resources that are pulled out, and the colonial powers walk away with the profit. So what's that particular mechanism looked like in your people's experience?
I would say that was like point in case of what you just described here in Alberta. My experience of, again, being on the horse and wagon in just like such beauty and landscape, green, lush, that's my memory of a child. And how I go back and it's dry and not looking well. The ecosystems have been kind of torn apart, dried out. It just, the way it looks now is so different. And that has been because of resource extraction and multinational companies being allowed to come in to here into Alberta, mostly through the Alberta government, but also the Canadian government. There's a Natural Resources Transfers Act that happened where it transferred over the subsurface rights from the federal powers to the provincial powers in 1930. But there's actually treaties that predate that. So treaties are actually the basis of how Canada was founded. So we here in Alberta, our treaties numbered 6, 7, 8. So where I live, where my family's from, is Treaty 8. And so Treaty 8 was signed in 1899, before the province of Alberta existed. So those are the founding of why and how Indigenous peoples came into agreement of allowing people to hopefully share and have that happen. But a lot of times these treaties that have been signed have been disrespected, disregarded, and not honored. And so that's, but that is unfortunate because that's, I think Indigenous peoples otherwise probably wouldn't have allowed it to happen in that way because they believed in the honor of word, right? The honor of somebody's word. And so, yeah, what happened was that from there you could see the Alberta government giving out land leases, leasing out territories just right under Indigenous people's feet, right? And so that happened in our homelands. And there was actually a study done in 2008 when I first started doing climate and energy work and was doing my master's in environmental studies, focusing on tar sands extraction specifically. And a Amnesty International, who I was who I have colleagues that I worked with from there, but I didn't work at Amnesty, but I was very much in touch with them because they do care about Indigenous people's rights here. And so they did a study for just our territory, specifically Lubicon territory, one of many, many Indigenous communities across Alberta. And their study and their analysis was that $14 billion had been taken out of Lubicon territory, $14 billion at that point, just out of resource extraction of Lubicon territory. And yet my family still went without running water, still went in outhouses, were fighting for the very rights of our homelands because they were putting up blockades, just saying like, wait a second, there's impact already. Women are miscarriaging. What is like there's something happening to their homelands. They put up a blockade. I was 7, and that was in 1988. And so fast forward to 2008, you already see the resource extraction just coming out. And yet, like when I first moved to the neighboring town and then eventually to Edmonton, I was just like, as a young Indigenous person, I was just like, what? They have running water, they have swimming pools, they have libraries, they have books. Like the discrepancy between the have and the have not, of even though the wealth was accumulated from our homelands and was, taking out oil, gas, tar sands, fracking, logging, and a lot of water. And so still to this day, that the water that is being drained from the aquifers is just like now millions and millions of cubic meters. And so that's why we see the drying out of our homelands and the wild forest fires where the ecosystems don't even have a chance, right, with climate change. And so these burning, I'm sure the audience here has heard of the massive forest fires because the smoke is just traveling down into the States because there's so much forest fires happening up here and also in the US. But here it's just burning because that land is so dried out.
So according then, we got back to that Amnesty International study, in many cases that you're alluding to, $14 billion worth of wealth kind of pulled out from underneath your feet, much of it underneath the ground, with one, I suppose you're saying, no consent on the part of the people in the land, and no sharing of those profits with the people on the land.
Exactly.
Yeah. What's your earliest memory of pushing back against that? You mentioned something that happened when you were 7, I think you said. What was that about?
It was actually international. It made international headlines, which was like a big deal in the 80s for Indigenous peoples to make headlines because we were very invisible. There was barely any representation of Indigenous issues. Even my experience within our school system curriculum, all of it, there was such an invisibility. I feel like that's very much the experience of Indigenous peoples, especially in the US. But yeah, it made international headlines, and my community was just it was just families. It was families, they always, every time you think of like a protest or a blockade, it's like, oh, these militant, these crazy people. And it was just literally like grandmothers, aunties, uncles, kids being like, hold on a second. What about the Lubicon people? We are very concerned. We did not consent to this. What is happening? So it was just, So I was 7, and my mom said she mostly left me she wanted me in the car because I was so young. But, so when I look up pictures, I see like my older cousins more there, but we were there. I was on a blockade at 7, but it just was like that was actually my memory. It's so funny because I think I've blocked it out because my memories is like just playing playing outside my grandparents' house, running after dragonflies. Like it was playing with my cousins. Like that was like eating moose meat, just like being with my family. Those are my memories.
Yeah.
So, but I do know, that was a part of our family experience, our community experience. And it was like the first part of being like, wait a minute, there's a big discrepancy happening here, and this needs to be discussed.
And then there have been, as I understand it, one or two major oil spills in your area.
Oh, I mean, dozens. Like, many of them are never made public. But every time I go home, people that work in our lands management is like, oh yeah, this pipeline spilled, this other pipeline spilled. I was just there last week, not last week, last month, fixing one of the solar projects that I helped put up in our community, because the inverter's down. And so went to the lands department, and one of the staff that works there from our community, she's like, yep, this was another spill. And so it's just like, every time I go home, I hear about them, but they're not making national headlines. One of the few ones that made national headlines was because it was one of the biggest oil spills in Alberta and Canada's history. And at that time, I was working as a climate and energy campaigner, and I asked the leadership of my community at the time to send me the one-page fact sheet that the government and company decided to send the community, even though they were waiting there. People couldn't breathe. Their eyes were burning. It was very close to the community, and it was massive. It was large. And so people were getting sick and feeling like their stomachs were turning, and the teachers of the school were like, we can't teach in this. They brought the kids out into the yard, and it was worse outside, because at first they thought it was a propane spill inside the school. So there's been massive ones, and then there's been smaller ones that have been swept up under the carpet. But that one in 2011 made national headlines because we put out a press release and said, no, you're not gonna get away with this time. This is too big, and people are so sick, and there's no accountability.
What are some of the longer term impacts that you all have observed with regard to oil spills?
I mean, it's when I went back 15 months later after that specific spill, because I was monitoring it, because I wanted, the company had said, oh, we remediated, everything's fine. And I was like, okay, let me go check. So went back, and there's just like a dead zone. Like, it just was still a water body, but you could see the film still on the top of the water. And our elders say, I've heard this for a long time, of if there's like little flies, if there's like life, that means that the ecosystem's healthy. But there's just like silence. There was no flies or anything hovering on that top of body of water. And this is like in the middle of the summer. And so there's a lot of flying ones that are flying all over with the flies and the mosquitoes and the black flies, the horse flies, the dragonflies. There was nothing there. It was just no seams. There was nothing. They were gone, so it was just seeing that and being like, okay, this is quote unquote remediated, but yet knowing that there's still a dead zone that's just going to sit here uncared for, because a company that should be responsible and accountable is not being responsible and accountable. And yet then it just lands again on the community's shoulders, which our community, as you have probably heard, is that there has been a lot of poverty that has been structurally imposed.
In preparing for our conversation today, came across this Cree proverb. At least it's popular online, that says, only when the last tree has been cut down, the last fish been caught, and the last stream poisoned, will we realize we cannot eat money. How does that resonate in you? It
feels almost prophetic. It's more than just, like, I would say, just a nice saying. It's almost becoming prophetic. And I've been posted that, used that actually. And if folks want to learn more about the oil spill, we did a short documentary, like just a narrated 11 minutes. You can find it on YouTube. It's called Oil on Lubicon Land. And that's actually at the beginning of that. short film that we made.
Yeah, we'll post a link to that in the show notes for the show. Another major issue that is prominent with regard to Indigenous population is the murdered and missing Indigenous women investigations. But can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this one is a bit more, I mean, all of it's kind of heavy, but this one's more personally heavy. Murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and, yeah, Indigenous relatives. So including not only just women and girls, but also like boys and men and two-spirited people. It's been an issue for decades here in this country. And I know it's also an issue in the US where there's, thousands and thousands of cases of murdered and missing Indigenous relatives that the cases go unsolved. And people are still missing, and people, even if they're found murdered, their cases go unsolved. And this is also the case for my sister, Bella, who was a college graduate in Toronto and just finished her as a college graduate 3 months later. Wrong place, wrong time. Case unsolved still to this day. So it is not just something that people say, it's something that people experience as a lived experience every day.
And these are not just, as I understand it, these are not just a few cases here and there, but thousands of cases.
Thousands, yeah. Thousands.
Yeah.
Spanning over decades. And some of them, it's, vulnerability, because serial killers, both in the US and Canada, see Indigenous women as vulnerable. More vulnerable populations, less punitive measures, and are identified as easier to victimize.
Thank you for sharing that. What with all of these historical realities that are indeed so heavy, what has been your relationship with anger, and or how anger has factored in your own work in the world?
Yeah, let me answer that, but I'll say too, for the listeners, one thing that I do feel like would be helpful, if you want to learn more about murdered and missing people, there was actually a national inquiry that many of our families pushed for in this country, and you can find it online. So, if you want to learn more about Indigenous history, which is not Indigenous history, I mean, it's Canadian history and U.S. history. It's not just something relegated to Indigenous peoples, but it's a collective shared history of how both U.S. and Canada exist. But something that's really helpful for people to, if you really want to deepen your understanding of these histories and really read documented accounts, but also or just government documents. So you can find them both online. One is called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and this is like volumes of documentation of residential school survivors, and then recommendations towards various levels of, including media, government, institutions, schools, police forces, recommendations. So TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that was released in 2015. And then there's a national inquiry on murdered and missing Indigenous women and children, and that was released a number of years back. And so my family actually participated in the national inquiry, where commissioners went across the country to interview families that have murdered and missing Indigenous women and children. And that is actually another really good resource that if even media, people in media can read, that is online as well. So feel free to look that up, because I think those are two really helpful resources that have been created, and a lot of hard work that was done by commissioners and lawyers and government bureaucrats, and then family advocates that have pushed really hard to have those both done, especially both for residential school survivors and then also for murdered and missing Indigenous family members.
We'll make sure to link to those as well in our show notes. So back to that question about your relationship with anger in response to these kinds of things. What's that been like for you?
I feel like there's like a righteous anger, there is, again, it goes back to that, like, what wolf are you going to feed? And when you realize, when you start feeling that anger turning into, seeding into hate, or it's seeding into something that doesn't feel good in your body, in my heart, then I realized, oh, I need to do some healing work. I need to pivot and kind of turn back to the light, so to speak, and then there's a righteous anger that is full of light, but it's also a righteous anger to do something to make the situation better. So that's my relationship with it, of really that balance of really the self-examination of what is my relationship to this? What am I feeling in my heart, mind, body, spirit? Like really feeling deeply into what it is, exploring, examining, and then doing the appropriate thing I need to do to ensure that I'm engaging within a way that's healthy for me and healthy for those around me and the world.
Yeah. So back to your comments about the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. From what I understand, from what bit I've read about this, the results have been mixed with regard to some injustices. There's been some progress with dealing with some things in a constructive way, and others perhaps not yet. But it strikes me that that's a profoundly different way than, for example, in the United States. We've never had any kind of analog to a Truth and Reconciliation Committee.
Yeah.
And instead, what we currently are seeing, the impetus in the United States is to increasingly squelch any kind of conversation about the difficult realities of our own history. What do you see from your perspective on what's happening south of your border, of the so-called Canadian border, with what's happening here?
Yeah, I mean, I see it and I'm witnessing it, with sadness, with a little bit of despair, and also indignation, because I feel like, it always comes back to education. It always comes back to educating our populations and our peoples across the board of what actually happened in the history of a people. And when you don't know the history of your own country, then it leaves you vulnerable to the perpetuation of that history, because you don't have that reflection of what can we do better? What can we do differently? What do we not want to repeat? But when an education and a history is left systematically out of the curriculum, then that is such a detriment to the people, all people that live in that country, including here as well. And I see a change, fortunately, here, that is different than south of the medicine line. We say medicine line for the border, because there's a history of, when Indigenous peoples were being killed and slaughtered, and, our scalps were worth 5 cents, and there's literally posters of it. And so people were, when there was that line designation of the border, Indigenous peoples ran north, trying to get away from being murdered and killed. And many people that didn't make that were shackled. And, there's the Trail of Tears that I'd say, if people haven't in the US know the Trail of Tears, definitely look it up, because that's, again, a collective history that's been not talked about in curriculum in education systems, from my understanding, but is, where people were shackled and forcibly removed from their own homelands that were Indigenous. And so I'd say it's again, a criminalization and a silencing and erasure of voices and history and people. And it's a detriment, because it just creates siloing, hate, and unnecessary division of humans. And it's a sad state of affairs, I would say. And I say what we see differently happening here, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it, because it's not perfect up here. don't get me wrong. Like you said, there is, for those recommendations of both the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the National Inquiry on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, is that there's still a lot of work to be done in making sure those recommendations are, taken to fruition and acted upon, right?
Yeah.
So there's there's the summary pages, and if you don't have time to read volumes of histories, there's those recommendations that are in both of those inquiries, national inquiries, and it's just unfortunate that that hasn't happened in the U.S. because I'm sure there would be, again, volumes.
Yeah. Share with us some about some of the work that you've done in seeking to address some of these perennial troubles, especially sacred earth solar, or any other that you would like to point us to about some of the work that you feel most excited about sharing about.
Yeah, I think because I've seen that, and experienced myself the lack of history shared in educational systems in our curriculum that's been left out. I have, for about 20 years, done many, many, many talks, hundreds into the thousands of talks, in classrooms, in town halls, in US Congress, Norwegian Parliament, just with investors, with media, with, I think that was related to like a little bit of the burnout of just saying yes and talking to as many audiences as I could to really ensure that there was an Indigenous perspective and recount of history and discussion of what was happening and those ongoing grievances that we still see happening. So that was a lot of the work that I have done over the past number of years. And then more recently, was working previously for non-Indigenous climate and environment organizations, and then decided to, with other Indigenous colleagues, decided to found an organization called Indigenous Climate Action, and then also founded Sacred Earth, which is, they're both Indigenous climate organizations. And Sacred Earth specifically, which is my main focus right now these days, and we have a number of staff, that's a national organization here, and we focus on climate education and literacy. So developing trainings for a national audience. So we have, again, continuing to do that education piece, but also in local communities where we're teaching about the research that I developed from my master's thesis. It's in there. My master's thesis is in the Just Transition Guide, which you can find on our website, and Sacred Earth Solar. And it talks about, energy education, and also kind of with that Indigenous lens to talk about what our experiences are, and then what our communities doing to address the climate crisis from their own leadership and from within their own community. So I also was able to shoot a TV show called Power to the People, and it is a TV show where I went from coast to coast to coast to interview and profile Indigenous communities that were implementing climate solutions across their homelands. And it was, it's a TV show that airs on 3 networks here in Canada, 1 in the US, and then 1 in Australia. And so also uplifting those community stories, not just my own, where we've done some work, but also Sacred Earth has helped communities from different provinces across the country in their homelands to implement climate solutions, namely solar, but also we're currently working on like a seed storage where communities can, store their own seeds and ensure that they can continue to plant and have some food sovereignty and security in their own communities. And so we also work on federal and provincial policy, climate policy, ensuring that there's accessibility and affordability for communities to transition, and then for energy transition. And then also we do implementation projects themselves. And so that's, keeps us quite busy.
Yeah, I bet it does. What are some of the implementation projects that you're most excited about right now, that you're finding yourself impressed with?
I love that we can work with community partners, and then we work with community partners to bring more capacity to those communities. So we we do the training within the communities, and then we help the community implement the project. We just solarized this past year a healing lodge with an organization called No More Silence. We also solarized a ceremonial longhouse with the Cayuga Nation in the Sour Springs longhouse to solarize their longhouse. We've solarized community partners in 3 areas in the West Coast, and then also solarizing with a youth group that is in Saskatchewan, that they're solarizing their one of their, like, for their community inside Saskatchewan, which is like a newer project for us. And then the original project that I did as my master's thesis was to solarize my community's health center, and that was a decade ago. And so that was the first project that I kind of got my hands in terms of tangible solar climate implementation. And now I'm supporting my nation, my community, to build a larger 1.5 megawatt system. So a much larger, kind of more like a solar farm. And so we're in those processes of fundraising, and then doing the capacity building and training, starting with this next month is a climate and energy summer school.
Again, we'll put links to all of those projects and resources on our website for the show notes for this particular episode. Melina, thank you so much for the conversation today. We've been talking to Melina Laboucan-Massimo. Thank you for your work and your lovely spirit and your time to share with us today.
Thank you for having me. It was great talking with you.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.